Good day, my name is Sky, and I appreciate you spending some study time with me. I'm here to help you make money in online poker by teaching you key strategies and getting you to take action. We've got Alex Fitzgerald back on the podcast today. He wrote a book, or actually co-authored a book, with a fellow by the name of Topher Goggin. The book is called Improve Your Poker Now. I'm holding it in my hands. I've skimmed through it. I really like this book a lot. I think you should pick it up. So here's my interview with Alex Fitzgerald. Please go to the show notes page, smartpokerstudy.com/pod520 to get the link to pick up this book for yourself and even to watch our interview on YouTube. smartpokerstudy.com/pod520. Gambate!
What do you say we cut the chit-chat a-hole?
Alex, it's great having you back on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So you recently got a new book, or wrote a new book, I should say, Improve Your Poker Now. Sorry, it's backwards in the camera, everybody. But so I wanted to ask you about this book, just a few different questions. First off, where did the idea for this book come from?
Well, when I was talking with Topher, my co-author, he actually made a really good point, which was if you were ranking how much someone knew about poker on a scale of 1 to 5, most of the poker books are written for people who are at a 4 or 5. They're written by high-stakes professionals for high-stakes professionals, which I also understand that people want to hear from the best players in the world, but generally, the best players in the world have very, very advanced techniques. Now, we were saying, someone should write a book for everyone who's at a 2 or a 3. That, say your stepfather loves to play poker, but maybe he doesn't catch a lot of the new lingo. Maybe he's actually a pretty decent player, but he's a solid player and he needs to maybe take a few more spots just to up his game a bit. We thought we could make something for him, and yeah, we were lucky enough to be able to put it together.
Great. How did you meet Topher?
He was one of my students, and yeah, just discussing things over email, I realized, wow, this guy's an incredible communicator, and we actually played a tag team event at one point at the series, and we got to meet up in Las Vegas, so that was pretty fun.
Awesome, man. What's the process like? I've only ever written books just by myself, right? I'm even my own editor, and I give it to some students to get their feedback. But what is it like working with somebody else writing a book? Like, how does that process go?
It's incredibly different. So what I did with this one is I have a lot of the source material. And Topher was my student, so he was giving me his interpretation of how he saw the material. And he would keep using phrases and he would reword things where I thought, God, someone needs to write this down because that's a really good way to put that. That's a really excellent way of explaining this tougher situation, this tougher concept. And then he was really behind this project and he said, okay, let me work on this for a little while. And he came back with some incredible pages. I read through them and gave my edits. He didn't honestly need a ton. He's such a clear communicator. I wrote a bit. So yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, it says here he was even on at age 11, like in the bio at the beginning, right? At age 11, appeared on Late Night with David Letterman, discussing his one-man sports newspaper. So this guy's been writing for his whole life, basically, it sounds like.
Yeah, he's excellent at it.
Yeah, good. I'm going to dive into it like starting next week, though. So I'm really looking forward to it. But another question for you. So you said this is book, and it says a guide for serious amateurs on it. If somebody is an amateur, they want to improve their skills, but they're kind of stuck, or maybe they're slightly losing player, what chapter specifically would you have them dive into to start building up their skills?
That's an excellent question. I've actually thought about this one a lot, and I think where you want to start is post-flop, because I think a lot of people know what hands they should and shouldn't play in many situations, but the biggest problems I see in most serious amateurs is one, they want to assert themselves pre-flop. So if you do want to check the sections on 3-betting, that's really good. But where you really see the fastest gains is post-flop, because a lot of people do, if they think about their plays for just a second longer, they'll realize that what they're doing doesn't make a ton of sense. They're just on autopilot. So let's say they raise from early position with pocket kings. They get 4 callers because it's a low stakes game. The board comes ace 10 5. Many times people will continuation bet there because they say, I'm continuing the story. I'm the pre-flop raiser. I need to bet here. My range is superior. That's not incorrect, but if they thought about it, if they ask themselves some of the questions we suggest in that book, okay, is this a value bet or is it a bluff bet? If they say it's a value bet, you say, okay, is queens calling you or is it 10 calling you? And they might think, I bet into that many people, I'm not really sure. Okay, is it a bluff bet? Is an ace folding to you? Well, probably not. Most people love top pairs. So if they actually think through their actions for just a second, they usually end up saving bets that they're giving away when they're autopiloting, and they are also preventing themselves from calls that could really sink them. There's a process that we describe in the book for that as well.
Gotcha. So when it comes, if we were to break down the most common mistakes for amateurs, serious amateurs, post flop at least, is it calling mistakes, checking mistakes, or betting, or I guess, or even folding mistakes that they're mostly making?
That's a fantastic question. So you can categorize most poker players as nits, stations, or maniacs. And nits fold too much, stations call too much, maniacs bet too much. And generally, I'd say the vast majority of amateur players, I'd say maybe 50 to 75% of them are stations, which means they call too much. So pre-flop, there's many times that they have the best hand in position. They should really double down at that point and 3-bet and make the pot really big on their terms. But instead, they just call and they let half the table in. And then you really are forced at that point to hit a huge hand in order to win a big pot multi-way. The other problem that they have is on the river, they don't want to fold ever if the bet size is half pot or less, because they feel really stupid if they fold to a 40% pot size bet and it turns out the guy was bluffing because, oh my gosh, there's such a huge pot out there and I really would hate to forfeit this entire pot. But what they're not realizing is those river bets are the entire session. Those 15, 20 big blind bets, if you're just giving them away, that can really end everything if you're not paying attention to it. So those would be the key mistakes I would look out for serious amateurs.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Calling for sure, big ones. And well, of course, some of my students have the problem of I've always taught like aggression wins in poker. And so like you had said originally, they open raise pre-flop with pocket kings, ace high flop. We have to see that because aggression wins. We just got to do it.
Right.
But then I get some students that come to me and they would be maniacs, or I would even call them gamblers, right? They're just constantly betting, flop, turn, and a river. And they lose a ton of chips that way. Sometimes their red line is just going up because they're winning a lot of non-showdown hands because they're just throwing chips out there, but their blue line is down, right? Because when they get called, they lose so much when they get called. How is a player like that who is a maniac right now, just betting too much? I know you said 50 to 60% are calling like too stationy, but the other ones, the 10% maybe that are maniacs or gamblers, how do they work on their game?
So that's a fantastic question. Maniacs first need to realize that generally, and this comes up in a lot of in my other materials as well, how to beat players who never fold and whatnot. Nits beat stations, stations beat maniacs, maniacs beat nits. So if most of the people at your table are stations, you're supposed to be value betting quite often. And that means you should only be bluffing in specific instances. So a good specific instance to bluff would be the big blind flats you, because the big blind flats with too many hands and hits too many mediocre pairs post flop, it maybe will give away those pots by the river. But if you raise from early position and the low jack or hijack cold calls you, that's far more likely to be a stronger range. And those people are much more resistant to folding by the river. So what you're supposed to do is viciously value bet. So use all that energy you have towards betting and put it towards value betting. So I'll give you an example that came up. I was playing in Oklahoma and I raised and the big blind called me and I knew this guy didn't want to fold for anything. So I had second pair, second kicker, but I went for 3 streets pretty large versus him. And it turned out to be a good hand by the river. He seemed pretty surprised I would bet that hand that much by the river. But that just goes back to nits beat stations, stations beat maniacs, maniacs beat nits. You don't necessarily need to play eights plus ace queen plus to beat stations. You just need a slightly better hand than what they're playing. So if they are calling you down with third pairs and second pairs, you can really go to town with second pair top kicker or whatnot, but you really shouldn't be bluffing that often unless you have a terrific reason to do so.
Yeah, and like you said, maniacs beat nit. So if when you're up against a nit, like a tight aggressive player like me, that's how you get me to fold. Just bet big and bet often. You know, when it appears that I don't have a good hand.
It works versus me too. Yeah.
Yeah. So everything you're saying right now sounds like it's definitely exploitative poker. You're playing the player. You know who you're up against. You assess what his range is and everything. And I know you're big on exploitative poker, but lately you have been talking in your different things that you coach. I haven't read the book, so I don't know if there's any GTO in this at all. Is there GTO first off?
There's some. We do touch upon it just so people can be familiar with it. We don't go too heavy into it. We just want people to be somewhat familiar with what the terms mean and whatnot. So if they're at the table and it comes up, they're not completely in the dark.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, so how did you, or what was it like your own process? I know you've been exploitative player, coach, professional player forever. How was it like for you making at least maybe a gradual transition to learning GTO?
That's a really good question. So to me, GTO is like when analytics came into baseball. If you're a baseball fan or if you ever read the book Moneyball, when analytics came into baseball, there were some teams that just took it as gospel versus some teams said, okay, I still think my scouts are seeing things that might not come up in the numbers. Let me see what those are. So a good example of when you would be GTO, exploitative, or using your sense at the table would be actually, not to get too deep into it, but there was one example in the World Series where the count was 3-0 and the guy had not swung at a 3-0 pitch in like 4 months. So the exploitative play was to throw a strike. The GTO play would just be randomize your pitch. That way he has no idea what's coming. A scout could have told you, this is the World Series. The kid's 24 years old. He's jumping out of his boots. Don't throw a strike right now. Well, they threw a strike. The kid hit a home run. It ended up changing the World Series. So that's an example of how exploitative GTO all mixes up. And when it comes to poker, when I first started interacting with GTO, I was being told all the time, you don't want to be exploitable. You don't want to be exploitable. And I thought, well, every time you're exploiting others, you're exploitable. So if there's a player at the table who is just calling every single one of your pre-flop raises, like literally 100% of the time, maybe the guy's intoxicated, it's 2 a.m. in Vegas, just raised it 20 times the big blind with aces. Everybody else at the table will know what you're doing and can exploitively fold versus you. But this one guy you're trying to make money off of won't make the adjustment. Now, once I started talking to some really good GTO players, what I ended up finding out was some of the best exploitative players came from a GTO background. And that's when it started getting really fun because they would say, look, Alex, okay, he's supposed to call you with this hand, and this hand on the river. That's about 58% of his top pairs. If he doesn't call you with any of these hands, you could just keep betting and print money versus this guy. That's when I started getting really curious because, ooh, I want that play. Show me that play again. And I started getting a lot of my exploitative plays based on the GTO framework. And it was really nice to know if he's calling you with this hand, this is a bad play. If he doesn't call with this hand, it's a really good play. So now you can make the judgment calls a little bit more precisely at the table.
Gotcha. Well, first off, how do you do your own GTO studies when you're away from the felt? You got the computer in front of you. What program are you using? How do you, what situations are you often looking at?
So oh gosh, great question. So GTO Wizard is the big one in my circle right now. I have used other programs, but that one's like the most souped up one right now. I actually rely on my friends who are much better with the programs a lot of the time to break things down for me because sometimes there's always different interpretations. So I would really recommend, if you're just coming into GTO and you're learning about it, I'd really recommend finding good resources about it first, just because sometimes you'll see, okay, the software says this, and you go, okay, I'm not exactly sure what that means, but a very good coach off the top of my head who's very good at putting things into common language, and he does so on his training site, is Faraz Jaka. He'll say, okay, the program says this, and this is how we should interpret it. And he's an extremely clear communicator. So finding someone like that is invaluable. And then where I'm really interested in how to use GTO, the one I started using it for a ton was a situation that comes up a bajillion times in no limit hold'em tournaments, because you should always focus on the situations that come up constantly. Is you raise deep in the tournament, the big blind calls. I got very curious with, what are they supposed to call down with if I triple barrel? And then once I started seeing what they're supposed to check raise with when I C bet, what they're supposed to call down with when I triple barrel, I was stunned, because I was thinking nobody is doing any of this. So I can just ram and jam and print money, versus a lot of wannabe regs that don't actually know what they're supposed to be doing in these situations. And then that's when things started getting really fun.
I bet. Absolutely. Have you found, just anecdotally, are you a better player now that you've been learning GTO and figuring out how to use those strategies on the felt? Like, have you found more success? Is your ROI for tournaments up?
Absolutely. So this actually comes up in Improve Your Poker Now, though. We talk about, it's kind of like when you take a golf lesson. When you try to adjust your swing, the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to go worse. Your first couple of rounds are going to be bad. So when I was first trying to implement a bunch of this stuff, it was a lot, and I wasn't doing it right, and I made a bunch of mistakes. So one thing I kept doing was, I'd say, okay, I have to call on this river, because if I fold this hand, I'm pretty much folding every single hand. And then this guy could just put bets in constantly and just print money versus me. What I didn't understand is you can still exploitatively fold versus people who can't bluff enough. So
Yeah.
I started going back to doing some really exploitable plays that still make me a little squeamish now that I know how bad they can be. But it's really improved my results. But yeah, once I did get a handle on it, it started becoming much more fun. It's really fun playing tournaments now, especially shorthanded events, because you'll set up these big bluffs and you see people's expressions like, what is going on? What is this guy doing? That's when it really is enjoyable to me.
I bet it would be right there. So with your, growing pains, learning to use GTO, well, like, what advice would you give somebody? Just push through and keep doing it? Or are there certain things that they can look at analyzing their mistakes that they're making and what they could do better?
I would say don't try to completely change who you are overnight. So, first of all, you should have the presence of mind to know, are you a nit, station, or maniac? And most of us fall into one of those categories. So when I play full ring, I know I'm a nit. My friends say I'm a nit, especially when the stacks are deep. I play nitty. So I need to watch out that I don't fold too much. If your friends say you're a maniac, everybody knows you're a maniac at the card room. Look at that. You're really trying to make sure you don't make your biggest mistake. So I would say, if you're a nit and you fold too much, look at what you're supposed to be calling with in many situations. And don't take that as gospel, because maybe you have to adjust to some people, but let the information percolate in your mind for a little bit and see how you feel about it, and see if you're missing things in some of these situations. If you call too much, look at what you're supposed to be calling with in some of these situations and seeing if you're overdoing it. And if you bluff too much, see what you're actually supposed to be bluffing with and when you're supposed to be checking back for pot control with showdown value or whatnot, and see when you're overexerting yourself. So I would say, find out who you are. If you're a nit, station, or maniac, embrace what your biggest error is and try to slowly peel that back and work on that first.
Nice. I love that advice. What if you are trying to use GTO strategies, I would imagine that they probably work best against tight aggressive or loose aggressive players who are kind of competent and they think about the game. Maybe they haven't studied GTO, but they know what's good and bad. Whereas a fish or a gambler, maybe your GTO strategy has
Uh,
less success against them and you should maybe be more exploitative against those players.
yes. So if you have just a fish that likes to call everything, like just forfeit your bluffing range and just value bet thinly. And that actually comes up a lot because, especially at the beginning of tournaments, everybody's got 200 big blinds. They feel like it's monopoly money and they just call down constantly. And I've been playing cash here locally. My new routine has been getting a lot of chips in tournaments, not even cashing, then going to the cash games and then making some money. And a lot of folks just love calling down in those cash games. And I think I forgot to say this. This is in Black Hawk, Colorado. But yeah, those folks just love calling down sometimes at the lower stakes. So you just got to value bet really thinly in those situations. But where GTO becomes really fun is, and it's actually kind of the exploitative side of GTO, is okay, this guy is a reg and he knows a few things. Where is he adjusting and how can I adjust versus that? So he's overfolding rivers because most people don't triple barrel enough. What should I do versus that? Well, according to the solver, if he's folding this hand, and this hand, I'm supposed to bluff with these hands on the river. Okay, let me jack up that bluffing and see what happens. That's when it becomes really efficient and different.
Yeah, I bet. So I know you and I've known you for years now. I followed you since the beginning, since I started learning and studying online playing poker. So many of my students know who you are. Um, but you're playing live Colorado Blackhawk poker. When you walk into a casino, I mean, maybe you've been playing at the same casino now for a couple of years if you've been living in Blackhawk for a while or in Colorado for a while. But do people recognize you? And if they do they play against you differently? Do they call you down? Do they try to bluff you like we want to bluff the professional player, a professional coach as well?
It doesn't happen that often. You have to be pretty hardcore to know who I am. There's much bigger names in poker, but I actually haven't been playing live the last few years. I in
Because of
2020,
COVID?
yes, that was it. It wasn't an intentional thing. I just started playing online and online started going pretty well. I was fortunate enough to win the 250K guaranteed in 2021. Had just one, I think it was my best poker year ever. And then I was just playing online. I was playing a ton. My win rate went really high on the anonymous sites and on Ignition. And it's only recently I said to myself, okay, I got to get out there and play live again because now every time I go to Vegas, I have to reacclimate to playing uh, playing live again. And I was thinking that's not really a good thing. You need to be really uh, adjusted to live play, but it doesn't take me too long to get back into it. I've been doing this for about 20 years, but the sometimes people will recognize me, but most of the time they don't want to three bet me and go after me because I think they think I'm a much crazier player than I am because
Yeah.
when I post something on YouTube, I want it to be entertaining as well. So it's like, okay, here's a really big bluff I did. But when I play an online session, I might do like 2, 3 really big bluffs the entire night. So that's not how I play normally. I normally play pretty solid. So most people just stay out of my way. Once in a while in Vegas, much more people, many more people know all the poker players who have ever done anything. So there's some people who do think I open too much. So I start getting three bet much more. So I have to adjust at that point.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Speaking of adjustments, one of my favorite stories, and I can't remember where you talked about this, it was probably in one of your other books, but you had talked about playing in Vegas and there was an Asian, like looking like a businessman, or he was a prior businessman, but now he plays poker and he would build crazy stacks and get more value than any other. Like he was a 60-year-old Asian guy, if I remember your story correctly. Um, and he would build crazy big stacks because he was doing like what you'd said. If this dude's not folding, he's just betting with top
Yep.
pair. He would bet
Yep.
3x, 4x pot over and over again.
Yep.
Yeah. So do you remember that story? Can you give me any additional details about learning from just watching some dude and an older guy at the table?
Well, I think a lot of people got their ego up in it, and he realized he was rubbing people the wrong way, and he just used that so well. And he seemed like a really nice guy when he talked to me, but I think guys kind of get their ego up in the game, and they're like, yeah, this, every poker player should look and talk like me. This guy shouldn't be the one winning. And yeah, he would just ram and jam, and they would call with the weirdest hands. And I thought, you got to know what your image is. Some guys, so there's some gals I know in Vegas who make so much money in cash games because they know which men will just fold because they don't think a lady can bluff, and they just bluff these guys left and right. And then there's some guys that table talk a little bit and try to rub you the wrong way. And then when you get angry, you start calling them down more than you should. And they just bet 1.8x pot with top pair second kicker, and they get paid off. It's all about taking what the table gives you, which is really hard to do because you have to have the presence of mind to know how each person is perceiving you, which it's really hard to know how people perceive you. But luckily in poker in the United States, sometimes people will even tell you how they perceive you. I don't think you have it any time or whatever.
Yeah, so that reminds me of another thing. I've learned so much from you. I really appreciate you being here with my audience, but I've learned so much for you. That reminds me of another thing, developing an aggressive image, not even aggressive, developing a loose image just by talking to people. If you're at the table, just chatting them up, they think that you're involved in every hand. Like you might see a couple of pre-flop hands and you play and you fold on the flop and stuff, but they think this dude is in every single hand. And that kind of, you cultivate your own image of looseness just by talking to people because they're playing a hand. You're talking to them 5 minutes ago. Maybe they can't remember that you weren't involved, but you were spouting your mouth off the whole time, And so that was one of the great things I learned from you. But for me, like I told you before, I don't like playing live. I'm just not a live player sitting with people I don't know. So I like the idea of developing the image of looseness, but I find it hard to just chit chat. I'm like not type A personality. I'm, I like to stay quiet and sit in the background and stuff. But how would you, if you have any advice for me on how to chat people up at the table? Because I imagine you do it all the time.
Yes. So that's a really good question because I didn't know how to do that for the longest time too. So to give yourself some credit, different locales are easier. I have noticed if you're, say, in LA, it's a little bit harder to strike up a conversation at the table because people are more combative at the table versus when I'm playing in Blackhawk, there's a lot of just normal people that want to chit chat. So it's much easier to strike up a conversation there. But yeah, if you ever hear people go, I saw this person play a pot and I thought to myself, who is this guy? If they don't even remember who you are because you haven't played a pot or said a word, they're going to start thinking you're really tight, which is really bad if you're a nit because now nobody's going to play versus you. Nobody's going to pay you off. So generally what I do is I talk to one person at the table. It's usually a senior citizen. I usually just ask them about their life because a lot of senior citizens are there for the socialization factor too. So it can be like the other day I was playing, I just asked a guy about somehow he offered where his kid was going to school and what he was studying. And I was just following up on that. Like, oh, how'd he get into that? Did he get a scholarship under that? Just things like that. And then just as long as you're talking, everybody thinks you're playing. A lot of people think when I play cash that, well, they go, oh, I want to see you play cash. I bet that'd be really fun. And I tell them, honestly, you'd be bored out of your mind because if I'm playing cash, I don't try to do anything special because I have infinite time to do whatever I'd like. And people like to pay me off if I'm talking. So I just adjust to that. But yeah, generally I'm just talking to people about anything and usually asking them about their life. And I'll talk to the dealers. That's kind of a neutral territory. sometimes with the young guys, I'll try to infuriate them by getting a guy talking about something that. So there was this one guy, he was hilarious. He showed up, and this guy loved fly fishing. He wanted to talk about everything fly fishing wise. So I asked him just 35 questions about fly fishing and just kept the conversation going for like an hour. I didn't even know anything about fly fishing, but I knew a lot by the end of this. But it was so funny. There was this kid next to him that was just clearly forgot his headphones at home or something. And he was just getting more and more frustrated the more he had to hear about fly fishing.
Yeah.
And he started playing kind of erratically. And maybe just because of my sick sense of humor, I just kind of kept it going just to see what would happen. But yeah, generally I just ask whatever the person wants to talk about. And usually sports is a really good neutral topic. Whatever jersey they're wearing, asking them about their team, if they're following them, that goes pretty well too.
Gotcha. Or a senior citizen, he's wearing a Navy hat or something, ask him about his time in the service.
Yeah, you'll end up hearing a lot of stories. It actually gets pretty fun. A lot of them have stories for days, so it's a pretty nice way to pass the time at a cash game table.
Yeah, absolutely. You had said something I'm sorry, I can't remember what it was, but I have a different question already teed up for you. So I have taught that aggression wins in poker, and as we had mentioned earlier, right? And I have given my students a razor fold only pre-flop challenge in the past. Do this for a week, do this for 3 days. No calling. You're only 2-betting, 3-betting, or 4-betting pre-flop, right? And then some students love that challenge and they take it on and they keep doing it for a month or 2 months at a time, right? Or at a stretch. But occasionally I'll get a player that says, I love this so much. They ask me, why would I ever call again? Raising pre-flop is just awesome. It's fun. I'm printing money. My red line is going up. Everything is great. Why would I call? And my answer, well, I'll give you my answer before I ask you for your answer. My answer is you don't want to be a one-trick pony, and calling sometimes sets you up for really good post-flop opportunities. You call with the hand that you don't want to bloat the pot, 7-5 suited, and it strikes something good on the flop. You can check raise, bluff them. You can get max value when they don't see that 7-5 coming. That kind of things. You don't have to be a pre-flop raiser every time. And especially as you move up in stakes, you can't be a one-trick pony. All of your opponents, they're noticing your patterns. They're going to know that you never call, and then boom, they're just going to keep raising and re-raising you. This guy's always bluffing. He never calls. There's things like that. So that's my reason why you have to mix in calls. And in general, if you break down your plays, you're playing 20% of hands, probably 15, 16% are raising, 4 or 5% are calling pre-flop. That's just a general idea that I have right there. Kind of like the 80-20 rule. Maybe it's 80% raising and 20% calling, But what is your answer to why should I ever call again?
So that's another great question. So I would say, so if you're newer to poker, I don't think it's a bad idea to increase the variance, because if you increase the variance on your terms and constantly put people in bad situations, good things can happen. But once you start developing a little bit more finesse, you can actually add in some cold calls pre-flop. So the thing I've noticed is, back in the day, I just told people, if you have a decision between 3-betting or calling, just 3-bet, because generally it's going to be more profitable. And that was very true for a long time, because people would play weak poker versus 3-bets. Now, a lot of those people who played really weak poker have gone broke. It's going to be 2025 here pretty soon. A lot of the people that are still around are a little less predictable. So if you're 3-betting and just going after everybody nonstop, now people are much better at 4-betting, check raising, triple barreling, making your life hell. And if you make things less predictable, you're going to have to be flying by the seat of your pants pretty consistently. So that can get really difficult really quickly. Versus, I've noticed if you throw a cold call in every once in a while, people go, oh, this guy's just like me. He's trying to see flops. So I bet when he does 3-bet, he's got something. And there's some hands that play really well multi-way, such as, essentially, if you play a multi-way pot, the average winning hand is going to be 2 pairs, 3 of a kind, flushes and straights. So what you want is suited aces, suited connectors, suited broadways, pocket pairs, because those hands make really great combinations of the nuts a lot of the time. And in a multi-way pot, if the pot gets very big, you want to have those combinations. But you should be focusing more on three betting with big card combinations because big card combinations make one pair. One pair tends to be the winning hand heads up, and it becomes a very expensive hand multi-way.
Gotcha. So a hand like, let's just say King Jack suited, a suited Broadway right there. You're on the button, somebody open raises. Why would you call in this hand, but maybe 10 hands later, you're in the same spot, you would three bet? What would be the difference there between those two plays with the same King Jack suited?
So what I would focus on most is, okay, let's say this is a very casual player. If it's a casual player, that person is going to go broke very quickly, usually. So I need to maximize the size of the pot as fast as possible so I can be the one most likely to bust them. So I would be three betting versus them. Now, let's say this is a very good player who opens. I'm not really looking to play my biggest pots versus the best players at the table. So I'm far more likely to call, especially if there's players to my left who are much worse at poker and I want them to enter the pot. So I'm more likely to call them. Now, let's say I've got a very loose bad player who has opened three times and I've three bet him three times. I might just call the fourth time because that seems to reset their annoyance with me. Oh, we just called this time. Okay, that's nice. He's letting me see a flop. And then maybe if 20 minutes passes, he doesn't really get worked up versus when I three bet somebody the fourth or fifth time, I've had people just shove 70 big blinds on me and then show me a three and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So there does become a point where the rubber band breaks and you're trying not to push it to that point because then the game becomes far less predictable. A calm poker player is a predictable poker player and you can use all of their past hands against them because they're really likely to still be playing that way. If they're just pissed off, it's really hard to know what they're going to do next. So you can't really use a lot of the data you've already collected. And it's a whole new ball game, which can be really hard to adjust to quickly.
Nice. Good thinking. I love that advice right there. Now, one thing I noticed from what you just said is you're absolutely still an exploitative player and coach. You didn't mention GTO. You didn't say anything right
No.
there. Not that I expected you to, but I really love that answer. Like that's the kind of answer I would have given, all about the opponent I was up against, the past history, what we've seen him do the past 3 rounds of play. That's awesome. I still, and eventually I do want to get to the point where at least a little part of me thinks GTO when a student asks me a question and I come up with an answer, or I'm playing in a spot and like I think about the exploitative, but then GTO maybe makes it a little way in and kind of influences my decision or helps me round out my play a little bit more. But I'm still at the point where I'm just 100% exploitative. GTO, I've done some studies, I've read some books, not books, but articles and stuff on it, and it really has not worked its way into my game at all. How often do you think GTO while playing or even while coaching versus exploitative?
So it's still mostly exploitative because generally that's going to get the fastest results versus low stakes players. And in a lot of my friends who are really in the GTO world, they'll even tell you, listen, if he folds this much on the turn, just bet. Don't even look at your hand.
Yeah.
And they'll even tell you versus bad players, they get really out of line. But what I really like doing is coming up with my strategies, seeing if they're working, seeing if it turns a profit in my databases, and then finding out how out of line I'm getting. So I'll run it by a player who's much more versed in the GTO world and go, how out of line did I get here? And if it's really out of line, I go, okay, I better really watch this because if I'm wrong, it could be pretty bad pretty quick versus if it's slightly out of line. Okay. If he's folding these hands, you're good to go. It's okay. It's kind of like a double check. You want to make sure you're not getting too bizarre, but there's still, I'll be honest, there's still a lot of plays I do that are massively exploitable. And I know like theoretically, I shouldn't be betting like 80% of the pot when I flop bottom set because then it's pretty damn clear if it's a multi-way pot, that I have something really good. And somebody theoretically could just fold top pair second kicker, not second kicker, top pair middle kicker, because obviously when I'm betting 80% pot into 4 players is pretty clearly going to be a very strong hand. So they should fold that mediocre top pair. But the last time I did that in a live tournament, I got 2 guys with like a 9 high flush draw and a 7 high flush draw to shove into me. Yeah. And then I had the biggest stack of the 4 tables I could see. So I still use a lot of the exploitative plays, and I'll keep using them till they stop working.
Nice, nice. Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. Love it. Everybody, highly recommend Improve Your Poker Now for serious amateurs, for sure. And Alex, tell the audience, please, how they can best connect with you and learn from you.
Yeah, if you enjoyed what I was talking about strategy, I do have a daily strategic newsletter that you can sign up for at pokerheadrush.com. That website, one more time, pokerheadrush.com. For signing up, you get 3 free training products. One's about triple barrel bluffing. One's about playing ace king when it misses the flop. And then there's a classic one about 3 betting. It's a little older, but people still seem to like it. So I throw it in there. And yeah, if you go to pokerheadrush.com, you can see all my social media handles and my YouTube channel and all of that. So it's a one-stop shop. And also you can get the 3 free training products and just unsubscribe if you'd like to. It's totally free.
Perfect. And I can attest to everybody, pokerheadrush.com, his daily newsletter is awesome. Like sometimes you'll get like a little 100-word blurb on something to do. Maybe it's poker mental mindset. Pay attention to your opponents at the table. Other times, Alex will give you an entire article, 7 things you're doing wrong and how to fix it, right? 2,000-word article, that kind of thing. So highly worth checking that out, pokerheadrush.com. But Alex, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you for having me.